Have you ever felt like your mind was too full and at the same time empty, as if thoughts don't stop running, repeating fears, memories and worries that you never invited, but also never managed to expel? There is a kind of silence that does not calm down, it just suffocates, and maybe you know well that place where the body is still, but the mind does not rest even for a second. And the more you try to organize your thoughts, the more they seem to get scrambled. It's like being trapped inside a dark room, groping invisible walls, trying to find a way out that should be simple, but it is not. Sometimes in the middle of the night, when everything is quiet, is just when the mind screams the loudest. And at that moment, a question arises that few have the courage to face. Why, even seeking God, is there still so much confusion inside me? What almost no one has told you is that there is something hidden right before your eyes. A spiritual key that is not locked, but forgotten. It's not something new, it's not something modern, and it's not complicated either. But it remains invisible to those who have never been taught to see. And this key explains why some people, even in the midst of chaos, carry a peace that makes no sense to the world. There is a way for your mind to be filled with a light that not only illuminates, but reorganizes everything inside. A light that does not depend on circumstances, does not waver with the bad day, and does not disappear when problems arrive. And the most unsettling, this path has always been accessible. What you're about to discover isn't theory, it's not passing motivation, and it's not pretty words. It is a spiritual code hidden in the deepest teachings of Jesus, capable of transforming the way you think, feel, and react to life. And if you stay until the end, something begins to change even today. Not around you, but within you, because there is a light ready to invade your mind, and maybe until now you just didn't know how to let it in. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Romans 12:2. In this video, you will discover profound teachings from Scripture that reveal how God enlightens the mind, replaces fear with peace, and reorganizes the interior with His presence. Each biblical passage will show real paths of transformation experienced by men and women who faced doubts, pain, and difficult decisions, but found clarity in listening to God's voice. As you continue, something begins to ring inside you, as if each word is a direct response to what you have been carrying in silence. This message crosses time and finds exactly the moment you are living right now. God does not act by chance, and the fact that you are here already carries a purpose, so allow that light to reach other hearts as well. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because together we can bring this truth to those who need to find hope again. There is a moment in life when everything seems too ordinary, too predictable, until something unexpected breaks the routine and completely changes the way you see reality. It was exactly like that with Moses. He wasn't in a temple, he wasn't in deep prayer, he wasn't looking for a supernatural sign. He was just living another ordinary day, taking care of the flock, repeating the same paths, stuck in a life that seemed to have no direction. And that's precisely when something extraordinary happens. A flame appears in the middle of nowhere, burning without consuming, drawing attention not only through the eyes, but through the soul. And at that moment, something begins to happen inside Moses' mind. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a silent call, a restlessness that couldn't be ignored. Because when God decides to enlighten a mind, He does not ask permission to routine, He invades the ordinary and transforms it into sacred. And perhaps the deepest is not the burning bush, but what happens when Moses decides to approach. Because many see signs, but few move toward them. The light of God begins to fill the mind when there is an answer, however small, however hesitant. And when Moses takes this step, everything changes. The voice that comes out of the middle of the fire does not only speak, it reveals. It doesn't just call, it resets. Moses, Moses. It wasn't just a name being said, it was identity being awakened. It was a man who saw himself as a fugitive being called as a chosen one. He was someone who carried guilt being remembered on purpose. And in that instant, the limited mind begins to open up to something greater, something that didn't make sense before, but now becomes impossible to ignore. And when the Lord saw that he turned thither, God cried unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses, and he said, Here I am. Exodus 3:4. Notice this carefully. God only spoke when Moses turned to see. This reveals something profound about how divine light enters the human mind. It's not about perfection, it's about attention. It's not about knowing everything, it's about responding to touch. How many times have small signs passed through your life, but were ignored because they seemed too simple? The light of God does not enter by force. It reveals itself to those who decide to stop, observe, and get closer. And when this happens, old thoughts begin to lose strength, fears begin to dissolve, and a new perception begins to be born. It's not just information, it's transformation. Maybe today, God is not wearing a burning bush, but he keeps calling, keeps awakening, keeps trying to reach your mind amidst the noise of your thoughts. The question is not whether he is speaking, but whether you are willing to turn to listen. And if somehow that message is stirring something inside you, as if it's a silent call that you can't explain, maybe it's no coincidence. Perhaps this is exactly the moment. If you felt this, write in the comments, Amen, because sometimes a simple answer is the first step towards a transformation that begins within the mind and reaches all life. There is a detail that many people overlook after an encounter with God. What happens to the mind in the following days? Because a moment can turn on a light, but it is continuity that decides whether that light stays on or goes out slowly. And it is exactly here that Joshua's story begins to reveal something profound. He wasn't just taking on a leadership position, he was dealing with an invisible weight, the responsibility of continuing something that seemed too big for an ordinary man. After all that Joshua saw next to Moses, miracles, direction, the presence of God in an intense way, now he is faced with a silent challenge. How to keep his mind steady when there is no longer someone guiding his every step. How not to get lost in your own thoughts when the pressure increases and decisions become lonely. And it is at this moment that God does not deliver a military strategy, does not present a detailed battle plan, but releases an instruction that seems too simple for the size of the mission. Let not the book of this law depart from thy mouth, but meditate on it day and night. This was not just a spiritual recommendation, it was a key to the mind. Because God knew that Joshua's greatest battlefield would not be external, but internal. Let not the book of this law depart from thy mouth, but meditate on it day and night, that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. Joshua 1:8. Meditating day and night is not repeating words out of obligation. It is allowing God's truth to occupy constant space within the mind. It is to replace thoughts of doubt with declarations of faith. It is to exchange anxiety for the continual remembrance of promises. Because what you repeat inside yourself begins to shape what you believe, and what you believe in begins to direct your decisions. Notice this clearly. The mind is not empty. It will always be filled with something, either by the noises of fear or by the voice of truth. And God, in guiding Joshua, was teaching that light does not enter by chance. It needs to be fed. There is discipline in this process, not as a burden, but as protection. A mind without direction becomes hostage to any thought, but a mind aligned with the Word becomes firm, stable, secure. Perhaps you have already noticed how certain thoughts come back frequently, as if they take root within you. Now imagine if, instead, God's truth occupied that same space, every day, steadily, silently, but powerfully. Not only would it change what you think, would change how you live. And if that word is awakening in you a sincere desire to hear God's voice more clearly, don't ignore it. Turn that moment into an answer. Comment now, "Speak, Lord, thy servant heareth." Write as an open prayer, as if deciding to make room for the light to enter. And if this message is strengthening you, leave your like, because then more people will also have the chance to renew their minds with the truth that sets them free. There is a part of the journey that almost no one talks about, because it does not combine with visible victories or impressive testimonies. It is the moment when, even after experiencing the power of God, the mind begins to be invaded by dark, silent, and persistent thoughts. Elijah arrived exactly at this place. He had just experienced one of the greatest miracles recorded, faced prophets, saw fire descend from heaven, witnessed the impossible happen before his eyes. But soon after that, something changed inside him. The same man who demonstrated courage in front of crowds now finds himself alone, tired, emotionally drained, and overwhelmed by thoughts that make no sense of everything he's ever experienced. He runs away, isolates himself, lies down under a tree, and even wants to give up everything. And perhaps this is one of the hardest truths to accept. Strong spiritual experiences don't automatically nullify deep mental battles. Because the mind, when it is not taken care of, can become a place of constant wear and tear, even for those who have seen miracles. Thoughts begin to distort reality, amplifying fears, diminishing strength, erasing memories of what God has already done. And in that state, everything feels heavier, slower, harder to bear. But what God does with Elijah reveals one of the most profound teachings about how divine light enters the human mind. God does not come with demands, does not confront with harshness, does not demand explanations. He starts carefully. First, it allows Elijah to rest. Then it sends food, and only then lead the prophet to a place of silence. There, something extraordinary happens. A strong wind blows by, but God is not in it. An earthquake happens, but God does not manifest himself there. A fire arises, but it is still not the form God chooses. Until, in the middle of all this, something almost imperceptible appears, a still, delicate, soft voice, and it is there that God speaks. And after the fire, a still, small voice. 1 Kings 19:12. This completely changes the way many imagine God's action. Because the light that transforms the mind does not always come in intense moments, but often in silent moments that many ignore. It is in the pause, in the rest, in the sincere listening that thoughts begin to reorganize, that the weight decreases, that clarity gradually returns. Maybe today you are not facing an external challenge, but an internal struggle that no one sees, thoughts that tire, doubts that come back, a wear and tear that doesn't appear, but that you feel. And just like Elijah, what you need may not be more effort. It can be presence, care, and listening. And if that part of the message touched something inside you, in a silent but real way, also respond in a simple way. Write in the comments, "God takes care of me." Sometimes a small statement makes room for a restoration that starts in the mind and reaches the whole heart. There is a silent change that happens when the mind begins to be enlightened by God, and it does not begin on the outside, but within the way you see that which has not yet happened, because so far you have seen how God calls, how he guides, how he restores. But now there is a deeper level, when he begins to transform the way you believe. Abraham was taken to just that place, a man already advanced in age, with a reality completely opposite to the promise he received. Everything around said that it was too late, that there was no more possibility, that time had passed. And yet, God doesn't change circumstances first. It changes the vision. God takes Abraham out and tells him to look up to heaven. It was not just a symbolic gesture, it was an invitation to break with the limits of human logic. Each star represented something that did not yet exist, but that was already established in God's plan. Look now to the heavens and count the stars, if you can count them. So shall your descendants be. Genesis 15:5. Notice the depth of this. God did not ask Abraham to understand, he asked him to see, because faith is not born when everything makes sense, it is born when the mind accepts a truth greater than what the eyes can see. And this is exactly where many get lost, because they try to use logic to validate that which can only be accessed by faith. The mind enlightened by God begins to operate differently. It does not ignore reality, but it is not limited to it either. She learns to live between two worlds, the visible and the invisible. And in that space, something powerful happens. Thoughts of impossibility begin to lose strength, and a new conviction begins to form, not based on what is happening now, but on what God has already declared. Abraham did not immediately see the fulfillment of the promise, but he began to carry within him a certainty that completely changed his way of living. And that is what the light of God does. It anticipates within the mind what is still on the way. It plants conviction before the demonstration. Perhaps there are areas in your life where everything seems stuck, with no answer, no apparent way out. And the more you look, the harder it seems to believe. But what God did to Abraham is still the same principle today. He doesn't start by changing the scenery, he starts by changing the way you see. Because when the mind is filled with the light of faith, the impossible ceases to be a sentence and becomes a process. And what seemed distant begins little by little to become inevitable. If you are here so far, it is because something within you recognizes this truth. There is a transformation happening, even if it is still silent. And at the end, let's enter into a deep time of prayer, where all of this will be delivered before God. Stick around until the end, because that connection could be the turning point your mind and your life have been waiting for. There is a point in the spiritual walk where it is no longer about what you know, but about where you are. Because there are times when the mind is not confused by lack of information, but by lack of presence. David understood this in a way that few did. Before every battle, before every major decision, he didn't rely solely on experience, strategy, or momentum. He was looking for something deeper. He placed himself before God, and that changes everything. Because when the mind is agitated, full of voices, opinions, and fears, the natural tendency is to try to solve everything quickly. But David did the opposite. He stopped, he consulted, he waited, and in this process something invisible began to happen. Confusion gave way to clarity. The pressure gave way to the management. God's presence doesn't just soothe, it organizes. It puts every thought in its proper place, silences what is noise, and strengthens what is true. And the most interesting thing is that this clarity does not come with effort. It comes with proximity. You will show me the path of life. In your presence there is an abundance of joy. Psalms 16:11. Notice that the path becomes visible in presence. Not before, not during anxiety, but when there is this real encounter with God. Many wrong decisions are not born of a lack of intelligence, but of the absence of this communion. Because a mind that is distant from God tends to get lost in possibilities, while a connected mind finds direction, even in the midst of uncertainty. David could have relied on his past victories. He could have acted on impulse. But he always chose to return to the same place: presence. This reveals a powerful principle. It's not the size of the challenge that determines your response. It's the level of your connection. Maybe today your mind is exactly like that, full of questions, doubts, possible paths, but without clarity. And the more you try to solve it, the more it seems like everything gets mixed up. What David teaches us is that it is not a matter of thinking more, but of drawing closer. Because when you stand in the presence of God, something begins to line up within you. Decisions that seem difficult are beginning to become evident. Paths that were hidden begin to reveal themselves, and little by little you realize that you are no longer being guided by fear, but by peace. The light of God fills the mind when it finds space. And this space is not created in haste, but in presence. It is in this place that you begin to see not only the next step, but the right direction. And if this message is leading you to desire this closeness, turn it into an attitude now. Declare in the comments, "Lord, I receive your direction." Write as an act of sincere surrender. And leave your like, because this simple action can help other people find that same clarity that only God's presence can bring. There is an even deeper level to this journey, because it is not enough just to have faith, to seek presence, or to know the Word. There comes a time when you need to learn to filter what enters your mind, because not every thought that appears within you comes from God, and not everything that seems good carries truth. This is where something comes in that many ignore, but that Daniel understood in an extraordinary way. He was taken to an environment completely contrary to what he believed. Babylon was not just a physical place. It was a system full of influences, distorted values, and constant pressures to conform to the pattern of that world. And yet, something inside him remained unshaken. Not because he was stronger, but because he was conscious. Daniel sat down in his heart not to defile himself. Daniel 1:8. This decision did not happen in the midst of pressure. It was made before. Daniel had already defined within himself what he accepted and what he rejected. And this reveals a powerful secret about how God fills the mind with his light. It's not just about receiving. It's also about protecting. Because an unfiltered mind becomes vulnerable. It absorbs fear, it absorbs doubt, it absorbs lies disguised as truth. And when this happens, the person begins to live in a silent confusion where he can no longer distinguish what comes from God and what comes from the world. Daniel teaches us that spiritual discernment is like a lens that separates what edifies from what contaminates. He did not need to isolate himself from the world, but chose not to allow the world to dominate his mind. And this requires positioning. It requires a decision. It requires vigilance. Maybe you're experiencing exactly this kind of conflict. Thoughts that seem true but bring unease. Internal voices that generate fear, comparison, insecurity. And little by little, this steals your peace without you realizing it. But when God's light begins to fill your mind, something changes. You start to notice what previously went unnoticed. You begin to feel when something doesn't come from God, even if it seems convincing. Discernment is not feeling more, it is seeing better. It is knowing how to identify what brings us closer to God and what distances us, even if it is subtle. And this clarity does not come from outside. It is born from an aligned, decisive, firm heart. Daniel did not wait for the environment to change to remain firm. He decided to be light within the darkness. And that's what completely transforms the way you live. Because when your mind is protected, your peace no longer depends on what happens around you. And if this message is speaking directly to you, as a warning, and at the same time a direction, do not ignore this moment. God may be using just that to awaken something within you, and you can be a part of something bigger now. When you like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. This word reaches other people who also need to learn to protect their minds and live with this light. Do this now and allow this message to continue moving forward. There is a decisive point in this journey where it is no longer enough to adjust thoughts, control emotions, or seek direction. Because if the root is not transformed, Everything that has been built can be lost over time. This is where Jesus' teachings come in a direct, deep, and even disconcerting way. He came not only to teach how to think better, but to reveal that the true light only remains when there is a new birth within the person. This completely changes the perspective, because many people try to live a life enlightened by God only by changing external behaviors, avoiding mistakes, controlling attitudes, but they continue to carry an old identity inside. And this disconnection creates a silent conflict, where on the outside there is effort, but on the inside there is still darkness. Jesus is not ignorant of this. He confronts this reality by saying that it is not about appearance, but about essence. It's not about looking transformed, it's about being transformed. And this transformation begins in the deepest place of the mind, in the way you see yourself. I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. John 8:12. Notice carefully. Jesus did not say that those who try, those who make an effort, or those who only believe superficially. He said, who follows me. This speaks of a continuous alignment, of a real delivery, of a decision that redefines identity. Because when someone truly follows Christ, something new is born within that person, and it is in this new birth that the mind begins to be constantly filled. Not as a daily effort to stand your ground, but as a natural consequence of who you have become. Thoughts begin to change, not because you fight them all the time, but because they no longer match your new identity. Maybe you've experienced it on some level, moments when you tried to change, tried to be different, tried to think otherwise, but it felt like something pulled you back to the same place. This is because true change does not start with behavior. It starts with identity. When God's light comes in deeply, it doesn't just illuminate dark areas, it redefines who you are. And from there, the mind begins to align with this new reality. What used to make sense no longer does. What seemed normal begins to bother. And that's not a loss. It is transformation. And when that light finds space within you, it doesn't come to visit, it comes to stay. But that only happens when there is complete surrender. When you allow God to not only touch your mind, but transform your inside. And maybe as you listen to this, someone will come to your heart, someone who needs that same light, that same transformation, that same peace that starts from the inside out. Don't ignore this thought. Write that person's name in the comments. Make it an act of intercession, because when you put a name before God, you connect with something bigger, and together, in faith, lives begin to be touched in a real way. There is a detail that often goes unnoticed after the mind begins to be enlightened by God. The light that enters also needs to be protected, because it is not enough to experience clarity, peace, and direction for a moment. There is a spiritual reality going on all the time, and the mind remains a sensitive field, vulnerable to distractions, encroaching thoughts, and silent influences that try to erase what God has started. This is exactly what Jesus taught his disciples in one of the most intense moments they have ever experienced. They were close, they were walking with him, listening to his words, seeing miracles. But even so, Jesus makes a direct, simple, and profound warning. Watch and pray. It wasn't optional advice, it was a necessity. Watch and pray lest you enter into temptation. Matthew 26:41. Notice that Jesus didn't just say to pray, but also to watch. This reveals something essential about how the mind remains enlightened. Praying connects, but watching protects. Praying brings God's presence, but watching prevents wrong thoughts from finding space. These are two practices that go together, like an invisible shield that guards the interior. The disciples were tired, distracted, and at that moment they did not realize the importance of this vigilance. And how often does the same thing happen today? The person experiences a moment with God, feels peace, receives direction, but then it relaxes, lowers attention, allows small negative thoughts to take up space again. Not abruptly, but subtly, almost imperceptibly. Mental mindfulness is not living in fear, it is living consciously. It is to realize when a thought does not come from God. It is to identify when something begins to steal your peace. It is to stop that which, if it continues, may weaken your faith. Because the light is not lost all at once, it goes out little by little when it is not protected. Jesus was showing that standing firm requires constant attention. It's not about tension, it's about spiritual sensitivity. It is to be present, awake from within, attentive to what comes in, what remains, and what needs to be rejected. Maybe you felt it. Moments when everything was fine within you, but little by little thoughts began to change. Peace diminished, clarity was lost. This does not happen by chance. There is a spiritual dynamic going on, and those who learn to watch begin to notice these movements before they grow. The enlightened mind is not the one that is never attacked, but the one that knows how to protect itself. And this protection does not come from human effort, but from a life that is aligned, vigilant, and connected with God at all times. Nothing happens by chance. If you have come this far, there is something being awakened within you, and what is yet to come can touch even deeper areas of your mind and heart. Stay until the end, because there is a prepared moment that can strengthen your faith and bring a renewal that you may not even know you need. There is a moment on the path when doubt does not appear as a denial of God, but as a silent distortion of what you believe about yourself. This is when the mind begins to whisper limitations, remembering failures, magnifying weaknesses, and reducing any possibility of change. Gideon was in that very place. He was not someone far from God, but he was someone who saw himself as too small for any meaningful purpose. While the people lived oppressed, they tried to survive in hiding, doing what they could, avoiding being seen, avoiding attracting attention. And it is in this apparently ordinary scenario that God decides to intervene, not with a spectacle, but with a word that directly confronts the way Gideon sees himself. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." Judges 6:12. That statement made no sense to Gideon at the time. Valorous, he was hiding. He felt weak, insecure, incapable. And this is where something profound begins to happen. Because when God enlightens the mind, he doesn't start by adjusting circumstances. He starts by correcting identity. It reveals a truth that is not yet visible, but that is already real in the spiritual realm. Gideon does not reject God, but he also cannot immediately accept what he is hearing. Your mind is still stuck in an old, limited vision, built by experiences, fears, and comparisons. And this shows something important. God's light is not always accepted immediately. It often clashes with what the person has believed for a long time. Then a process begins. Gideon asks for signs. He questions. He seeks confirmations. And this is not empty incredulity. It is a gradual building of faith. God, in his patience, does not reject him for this. On the contrary, he responds, confirms, strengthens. Because he understands that the human mind often needs evidence to align the heart with the truth. With each answer, something inside Gideon begins to change. Insecurity begins to lose strength, doubt begins to give way, and a new perception begins to be born. He begins to see not based on what he feels, but on what God has declared. This reveals a powerful principle. Divine direction is not just about knowing what to do, but about becoming someone capable of obeying. Because often the biggest obstacle is not in the way, but in the way the person sees himself in front of it. Maybe you've felt it. Moments when an opportunity arises, a call appears, a direction presents itself. But something inside you says that you are not capable, that you are not enough, that it is not the time, and little by little the mind creates arguments that seem true, but in reality just keep you in the same place. What God did to Gideon still happens today. He keeps calling ordinary people with imperfect stories, with real doubts, but who are willing to listen. And when that arrangement exists, the light begins to come in, not all at once, but step by step. The enlightened mind learns to trust God's voice above visible evidence. He learns to take steps even without understanding everything. He learns that true security is not in what he sees, but in who he is leading. And it is in this process that what seemed impossible begins to become a path. There is a silent wound that often no one sees, but that constantly dominates the mind. Guilt, not the one that passes quickly, but the one that settles in, that whispers memories, that repeats past mistakes as if they were still happening now. And the more a person tries to move on, the more this inner voice pulls them back, making them feel unworthy, distant, disconnected. It was exactly in this state that this woman approached Jesus. She didn't just carry a difficult background, she carried a mind marked by rejection, judgment, and shame. Every look around reinforced this. Each silence seemed to condemn. But still, something inside her pushes her to take a step that few would have the courage to. She enters that environment knowing that she is not welcome, knowing that she will be watched, perhaps criticized. But he decides to get closer anyway. And when he gets close to Jesus, something happens that can't be explained with words alone. She doesn't speak, she doesn't argue, she doesn't try to justify herself. She just cries. His tears were not just emotion, they were an expression of everything that was trapped inside his mind. Every drop carried pain, regret, weight, but also a deep desire to be free. And at that moment, as she anoints Jesus' feet, the whole room seems to stop, as if something invisible is happening there. The most impressive thing is not her gesture, but Jesus' reaction. He does not push her away, does not expose her, does not reinforce her guilt. He sees beyond what everyone else was seeing. He doesn't just see her past, he sees her heart. Therefore I say to you, his many sins are forgiven him, because he loved much. Luke 7:47. This answer completely breaks human logic, because where the world expects condemnation, Jesus releases forgiveness. Where her mind carried guilt, he pours out grace, and it is at that moment that something profound happens inside her. That weight that once dominated your thoughts begins to lose strength. God's light enters exactly the most wounded areas. It does not avoid pain, it goes through pain. It does not ignore the past, but neither does it allow it to define the future. And when that light finds space, thoughts that once seemed unshakable begin to unravel. How many people live in prison exactly like this, trying to move on, but being constantly reminded of who they were, what they did, what they lost? But the encounter with Jesus shows something powerful. Guilt does not resist true forgiveness. The mind that was previously imprisoned begins to breathe again. What seemed impossible to forget loses control, and in the place of shame, a peace begins to be born that does not come from the absence of mistakes, but from the presence of grace. Maybe on some level, you also carry something like this, something that no one sees, but that weighs inside you. And maybe this moment is happening exactly to show you that there is liberation, not by force, but by encounter. And if that word came to you so directly, as if it were playing a part that you could never explain, don't ignore it. God reaches out in unexpected ways. If this has spoken to your soul, write in the comments, "I trust God." May this simple attitude be the beginning of something new happening inside you. There is a defining moment in anyone's life when everything seems out of place, but the most dangerous thing is not what is around, it's what happens inside the mind. because when one turns away from God, it is not only the spiritual distance that increases, it is the perception that is distorted. What was once clear begins to become confusing. What was right begins to seem relative, and little by little, the person begins to live a reality built by illusions. This is exactly what happened to the prodigal son. At first, everything seemed like freedom, choice, autonomy. He believed he was gaining something, but he was actually losing without realizing it. His mind was filled with ideas that seemed attractive, but that took him to a place of emptiness, scarcity, and total disconnection with his true identity. And the deepest point of this story is not when he loses everything. That's when he realizes. Because until that moment, he was living, but he wasn't seeing. He was walking, but without direction, until something happens inside him. A silent but powerful awakening. And he came to himself and said, "How many of my father's hirelings have an abundance of bread, and I perish here of hunger?" Luke 15-17. This making it into itself reveals something transformative. It wasn't just a decision to return physically, it was a mental, spiritual, and emotional return. It was the moment when the light began to enter again, breaking the illusions that had previously dominated her thoughts. True repentance is not intense guilt. It is profound clarity. This is when the mind returns to see the truth without distortions. It is when the person recognizes where they are, understands what they have lost, and above all, remembers who they really are. And when this movement happens, something extraordinary begins to form. Because God doesn't just accept the return, it restores completely. He does not receive the child as someone inferior, but gives back his identity, his value, his place. This shows that God's light not only illuminates the way back, it rebuilds all that has been lost inside. Perhaps on some level, you have already felt this. Moments when you moved away, when you got lost in thoughts, decisions, or paths that seemed right, but that took you away from peace. And maybe there's a part of you that still believes you can't go back to the way you used to. But this story shows otherwise. The return to God is not a path of shame. It is a re-encounter with lucidity. It is when the mind works clearly again, when the heart has direction again, when identity is restored. God's light is still available no matter how far away it seems. And when you decide to come back, even if in silence, even if inside, something starts to align again. If you are here, it is not by chance. There is a reason why this message has reached you at this time. Stay until the end, because there is still something deeper being prepared, something that can touch areas that you didn't even realize needed healing and direction. There is a type of distraction that does not make noise, does not attract attention, but slowly takes the mind away from what really matters. It's when the person continues living, making decisions, following their routine, but without realizing that he is wasting the spiritual time that God is releasing. And it was precisely to confront this state that John the Baptist emerged. He did not come with soft words, nor with comfortable messages. He came urgently. His voice carried a different weight, like someone who sees something that others have not yet noticed. While many were busy with their own lives, John was announcing that something bigger was about to happen, and that the mind needed to prepare. Repent, you people, because the kingdom of the heavens is at hand. Matthew 3:2. This was not just a religious message, it was a wake-up call. Because the repentance that John preached was not just about forsaking mistakes, it was about aligning the mind with God's timing. It was realizing that something new was being released, and that to remain distracted meant missing out on a unique spiritual opportunity. The enlightened mind does not live on automatic. It recognizes when God is moving, when a season is changing, when a new cycle is beginning. And this requires sensitivity, because many times God begins to act in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. and those who are not attentive simply do not notice. Joanne prepared paths, but not only physical roads. He was preparing minds, awakening consciences, breaking old patterns of thought. He was saying, in a direct way, that it was no longer possible to live in the same way because time had changed. And that remains true today. There are times when God is calling, adjusting, directing, but the person is still stuck with the same distractions, the same thoughts, the same priorities, and little by little, what could be an advance turns into a delay. Maybe you've felt it in some way. A restlessness that appears without explanation, a feeling that something needs to change, that it is no longer possible to continue as before. This is no coincidence. Often it is God Himself awakening your mind to a new time. Spiritual urgency is not about fear, it is about perception. It is to understand that there are moments that do not come back, opportunities that are not repeated in the same way. And when the mind is enlightened, it responds, it adjusts. She takes a stand. John offered no comfort, he offered direction. He did not soften the message, he awakened the conscience. Because he knew that what was to come required a mind that was prepared, aligned, ready to recognize and receive. And maybe this moment is exactly that for you. Not just another video, but a silent call to adjust something within you, to align thoughts, to awaken to something greater. If, upon hearing this, you feel that God has been good, even in the details that often go unnoticed, recognize this now. Write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple word becomes a mark of a new time starting inside your mind. There is an inevitable consequence when the mind is truly enlightened by God. It cannot remain silent, because what transforms from the inside naturally begins to overflow outwards, and few stories show this as intensely as that of the Gadarene man. Before he met Jesus, his mind was a field of chaos, fragmented thoughts, lost identity, emotions out of control. He didn't live, he survived in the midst of an internal confusion that no one could understand or resolve. It was as if his mind was imprisoned in a constant darkness, without direction, without peace, without meaning. But everything changes in a single encounter. When Jesus enters the scene, there is no negotiation with that which imprisoned him. There is authority, there is liberation. And immediately what once dominated your mind loses control. The man who lived between screams and torments is now seen in silence, sitting, conscious, present. This is not just an external change, it is a complete reconstruction of the interior. And the most impressive thing comes later. Because when he finally experiences clarity, when his mind goes back to its place, when his identity is restored, he makes a request that seems logical. He wants to go with Jesus. He wants to stay in that place of peace. But the answer he receives reveals something even deeper. Go to your house, to your people, and tell them how great things the Lord has done for you. Mark 5:19. Jesus does not call him to hide. He calls him to witness, because a transformed mind becomes a living message. What God did in him was not just for him, it was to reach others. His story now carried power because it was real, visible, undeniable. And this reveals a principle that many do not realize. God's light does not only restore, it positions. It turns ordinary people into living evidence that something supernatural has happened. Not through perfect speeches, but through transformed lives. You may not have realized it yet, but every change God makes within you carries a purpose beyond you. Every thought renewed, every area restored, every moment of clarity. All of this becomes a way to impact other people who are still living in the same place of darkness that you once were. Because when someone sees a life that has really changed, something awakens. When one perceives peace where there was once confusion, firmness where there was doubt before, purpose where there was emptiness before, that speaks louder than any words. The enlightened mind does not need to force influence, it naturally influences. She carries a different presence, a different way of living, a different response to situations. And this begins to generate an impact around you without even realizing it. Maybe you're in a process, maybe there are still areas being transformed, but that doesn't stop God from already using your life as a testimony. Because the light, even in growth, already illuminates. And if this word has reached you, it is because there is something being built inside your mind that will still reach other people. Stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed can show you how this transformation not only continues, but deepens in a way that you may not have imagined yet. There is something deeply encouraging when we understand that the transformation of the mind does not happen instantaneously, but progressively, because many start this journey expecting immediate changes, quick responses, constant stability. But they get frustrated when they realize that there are still flaws, impulses, and moments of weakness. And it is exactly here that Pedro's life becomes a realistic and powerful mirror. Peter was not balanced at first. He was intense, impulsive, spoke before thinking, acted before understanding. At one moment he showed unshakable faith. At the next he revealed fear and insecurity. His mind seemed to oscillate between clarity and confusion, between courage and doubt. And yet, Jesus never gave up on him. The most striking thing is not only Pedro's successes, but his falls. Because there was a time when, even after walking with Jesus, listening to his teachings, and witnessing miracles, Peter failed in a profound way. He denies what he said he would never deny. And at that moment, all could seem lost. But even before this fall happened, Jesus had already declared something that reveals God's heart in this process. "But I have prayed for thee, that thy faith may not fail." Luke 22:32. This completely changes the perspective, because Jesus didn't say that Peter wouldn't fail, but that his faith wouldn't be destroyed. This shows that God's light in the human mind does not automatically eliminate all weaknesses, but sustains a person even when he fails. True transformation is not the absence of mistakes, it is permanence in the process. Peter fell, but he did not remain fallen. He got up, was restored, and over time became someone completely different from the impulsive man of the beginning. The light of God was working within him continuously, adjusting thoughts, strengthening decisions, shaping character. What was once instability has become firmness. What was impulsiveness has been transformed into discernment. And it didn't happen overnight, it happened along the way. This reveals something essential for anyone who wants to have an enlightened mind. The process is as important as the destination, because each stage, each learning, even each fall, when accompanied by regret and return, becomes part of the construction. Maybe you felt like Peter at some point, decisive but unstable, confident but sometimes insecure, willing but still failing in areas I wish I had already overcome. And this can generate a sense of silent frustration, as if you are not moving forward. But the truth is that God does not measure his transformation only by his successes, but by his willingness to remain. The light keeps working, even when you don't realize it. It keeps adjusting, aligning, strengthening. And just like Peter, what seems unstable today can become firm. What still fluctuates today can become constant. Because when God begins a work in someone's mind, he doesn't abandon halfway. There is a detail that many overlook in the spiritual walk. God's light can even turn on within the mind, but if there is no right environment, it can weaken over time. Because the mind was not made to walk alone. There is a force that only manifests itself when there is communion, when there is connection with other people who are also seeking the same presence. The early church understood this deeply. They did not live their faith in isolation, each for themselves, trying to keep their own light burning. They walked together, shared, prayed, learned, and strengthened each other. There was something in that environment that went beyond words or rituals. It was an atmosphere where God's presence became constant, and enduring with one accord all the days in the temple, they ate together with joy and singleness of heart. Acts 2:46. Realize the strength of this. They persevered, that is, it was not something occasional, it was continuous, and they were unanimous, aligned, connected. This creates a kind of environment where the mind finds stability. Because when you are surrounded by people who also seek the light, something inside you naturally strengthens. Now think sincerely, how many times does the mind begin to weaken just when there is isolation? When the person moves away, closes himself off, tries to deal with everything alone. In this space, negative thoughts find more freedom, doubts grow more easily, and clarity begins to diminish. God never intended for the walk to be lonely. It also manifests itself through relationships. Sometimes a word you need to hear comes through someone. A direction you seek appears in a simple conversation. A strengthening that seemed distant happens in a moment of communion. The enlightened mind is not only one that seeks God individually, but also one that positions itself in environments where that light is shared. Because there is something powerful when people come together for the same purpose. Faith is strengthened, hope is renewed, and God's presence becomes even more evident. Maybe you're trying to sustain everything yourself, trying to keep your mind steady, your faith alive, your peace intact, but feeling that it is getting harder and harder. This doesn't mean weakness. It means that something is missing from the environment around you. Communion is not a detail. It is part of the process. It is an invisible support that keeps the mind aligned, protected, and empowered. And when you allow yourself to live this, you realize that what seemed heavy begins to become lighter. And if this message is making you realize the importance of not walking alone, maybe it's time to also help others get out of this place. There are many people right now in need of exactly that word that you are hearing. By liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and activating the bell, you become part of something bigger, allowing this light to reach other minds that also need to be strengthened. There is a time in life when everything can feel right on the outside, but completely misaligned on the inside. The person believes that he is on the right path, defends his ideas with conviction, makes decisions with confidence. But even so, it is far from the truth. Paul was just like that. His mind was full of certainty, but empty of the light that truly transforms. He was not indifferent to God, on the contrary, he was extremely dedicated. But his dedication was built on a mistaken understanding. And this reveals something profound. It is not the intensity of belief that guarantees the truth, it is the alignment with the light of God. And then, halfway through, everything changes. No warning, no preparation, no control. A light breaks the path. Not an ordinary light, but something so strong that it interrupts not only your steps, but your way of thinking. What he believed with such conviction begins to crumble in the face of a revelation he cannot ignore. And as he went on the way, it came to pass when he came near Damascus, that suddenly there shone around him a flash of light from heaven. Acts 9:3. This moment was not just a meeting, it was a rupture. Because when God's light invades the mind, it doesn't conform to the old ideas. It confronts, exposes, and redefines it. Paulo falls, not only physically, but in everything that supported his identity until then. And it is at this point that something decisive happens. He must choose between resisting or surrendering, between holding on to your old convictions or allowing God to rebuild everything from the inside out. And when he surrenders, a transformation begins that does not only alter isolated thoughts, completely changes the direction of your life. The mind that once persecuted now starts to announce. The one who was once convinced that he is right now becomes someone willing to learn, to listen, to be guided. This shows that God's light does not come to adjust details, it comes to redefine trajectories. How often does this also happen more silently? People living, deciding, believing that they are on the right path, until at some point something happens and everything starts to make sense in a different way. A word, an experience, an inner awakening. And suddenly, what seemed clear is no longer clear. God's call is exactly that, an awakening that cannot be ignored. It is not just an invitation to change behavior, but a summons to live something bigger, deeper, more aligned with a purpose that goes beyond human comprehension. And when this light really enters, it does not leave the person in the same place. There may even be doubts at the beginning. There may be a time of adjustment, but the direction will never be the same again. Because those who have already been reached by this light can no longer live as before. The mind begins to be reorganized, values begin to change, priorities adjust, and what once seemed important loses strength, while what was previously ignored now has meaning. Paul didn't just change his mind, he changed his life. And this reveals that a true encounter with God has the power to completely rewrite someone's history, starting with the mind and reaching every decision, every step, every direction. There is a subtle but profound difference between hearing sounds and recognizing a voice, because the world is full of noises, thoughts, opinions, distractions. But God's voice continues to be soft, constant, and accessible to those who learn to discern. And that's exactly what happened to Samuel, still young, when he began to experience something that many adults never developed: spiritual sensitivity. He was in the right place, in the right environment, but he still couldn't identify when God was speaking. And this reveals something important. Being close to the things of God does not automatically mean recognizing his voice. There is a process, a learning, an inner construction. Samuel hears his name being called during the night, but he doesn't understand where it comes from. He runs to Eli, believing that he was the one who called. This happens more than once. The voice was clear, but the discernment was not yet formed. How often does this also happen today? God speaks, but the mind misinterprets it. God calls, but the person associates it with something else, until the moment comes when everything starts to align. Samuel receives guidance, positions himself differently, and this time, when the voice calls again, something changes inside him. "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." 1 Samuel 3:10. This answer reveals a mind that has finally opened up to real listening, not only listening but recognizing, receiving, positioning oneself with attention. And that's exactly what God's light does. It adjusts perception. It teaches you to differentiate between what is just thought and what is divine direction. The problem is not that God has stopped speaking. The problem is that many are too busy to notice. The mind is full of noises, worries, constant distractions. And in the midst of this, the voice of God ends up being ignored, not by absence, but by lack of attention. Developing this discernment requires something that is not always comfortable: inner silence. It is learning to turn down the volume of what is external in order to perceive what is spiritual. It is to create space to listen, without haste, without interference, without pressure. And the more the mind aligns with God, the more that voice becomes familiar. Not in the sense of routine, but of recognition. The person begins to perceive directions, feel alert, receive peace in decisions and restlessness when something is not right. This is not by chance. It is the result of a mind that is being continuously enlightened. Maybe you felt something like this at some point, a strong impression, an inner direction, a sense that you should do or avoid something. And then he realized that it made sense. This is part of this process. God keeps speaking, but few are really listening. And if this message is bringing clarity to something you have already lived or are living now, don't let it pass as just another moment. Answer as Samuel did. Write in the comments, "Speak, Lord, I hear." Because when this disposition is born, the mind begins to enter a new level of sensitivity and direction. There is a kind of pain that cannot be explained with simple words. A pain that is not only external but invades the mind, questions certainties, shakes structures, and makes even faith seem distant for a moment. Job knew this place. He didn't just lose things around him, he faced a complete breakdown of what sustained his life. And in the midst of it all, his mind was pushed to the limit. Questions began to arise. Thoughts mingled, emotions intensified. Friends tried to explain, but they didn't understand. God's silence seemed to add to the weight even more. And perhaps this is one of the most difficult moments for anyone, when everything is falling apart and there are no immediate answers. But it is exactly in this scenario that something profound begins to reveal itself. Because God's light is not only manifested when all is well, it becomes even more evident when everything seems dark. And with Job, it happened from the inside out. Even in the midst of pain, he did not completely lose his reference. He didn't understand what was happening, but he still chose to trust. This does not mean the absence of questioning, but the presence of faith, even without explanation. For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the last upon the earth. Job 19-25. This statement was not born out of a moment of comfort, but from a scenario of extreme suffering. This reveals something powerful. The enlightened mind is not one that never suffers, but one that finds stability even within the storm. Job had no answers at that moment, but he had a conviction. And this conviction worked as an anchor, preventing his mind from being completely overwhelmed by chaos. Because when everything around loses its meaning, it is this inner light that sustains. How often does life also seem like this? Situations that don't make sense, pains that have no explanation, moments when the mind tries to understand but doesn't find answers. And in this process, thoughts begin to press, doubts arise, fatigue appears. But what this story shows is that God's peace does not depend on the absence of problems. It can exist even in the midst of them, not as a denial of pain, but as a silent force that sustains the mind from falling apart. God's light at this level does not immediately eliminate suffering, but it prevents it from destroying you from within. She holds something steady when everything seems unstable. It sustains hope when everything around seems lost. And over time, what seemed to be just pain begins to give way to a deeper understanding, to a restoration that is not only external, but internal. Because the mind that goes through the storm with God does not come out the same. If you've made it this far, there's a reason. What you hear next may touch exactly that area that you have not yet been able to explain, but that God knows deeply. Stay until the end, because this message may be the silent answer that your mind has been waiting for to find peace in the midst of what you are experiencing. There is a moment in the journey when the mind finds itself cornered, with no apparent way out, as if all paths had closed at the same time. This is exactly what the people of Israel faced before the Red Sea. Ahead, an impossible obstacle. Behind, an enemy advancing. All around, fear, pressure, and despair. And within them, a silent question. What now? Because when the mind doesn't find a way out, it tends to collapse. Thoughts begin to accelerate. Fear distorts perception, and what once seemed like a promise begins to look like illusion. Many there began to question, doubt, even wish to go back. This shows how, in the face of the impossible, the human mind can quickly lose clarity. But Moses was facing the same scene, seeing the same sea, hearing the same noise from the enemy. And yet, There was something different inside him, not because the situation was minor, but because his mind was aligned with God's leading. And then comes an instruction that defies all logic. There was no bridge, there were no boats, there was no human strategy capable of solving that, but there was a word. And when Moses responds to that direction, something begins to happen that no one could have predicted. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to be withdrawn by a strong east wind all that night. Exodus 14:21. Notice this deeply. The sea did not open immediately. There was a process. All night long, something invisible was happening. While many may still be looking and seeing no change, God was already at work. This reveals that not every miracle is instantaneous to the eye, but begins in the invisible before manifesting itself in the visible. And when the path finally appears, it is not just a physical crossing, it is a mental transformation. Those who cross are not the same ones who arrived there, because the impossible that opened up before them didn't just solve a problem. He broke inner boundaries. The mind that once saw only barriers now understands that there are paths that do not depend on human logic. Faith ceases to be theory and becomes experience. And that changes everything, because once someone sees God open a way where there was none, they never think the same way again. How many times does life also put you in front of seas like this? Closed situations, impossible decisions, moments when everything seems blocked. And the natural tendency is to believe that it's over, that there's nothing more to do, but God's light makes you see differently. It does not deny reality, but reveals a dimension above it. It shows that what seems like an end may actually be the beginning of something you can't see yet. God's signs are not just for resolving external situations. They exist to expand your mind, to teach you to trust, to show you that there's more going on than your eyes can realize. Because when God acts, He doesn't just change circumstances. It changes the way you see everything. There is a point in the journey when faith ceases to be comfortable and starts to be confronted directly. It's no longer about believing when everything is fine, but about standing firm when everything presses backwards. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego arrived at this very place. They were not facing a simple doubt. They were facing a real, immediate threat, where any wrong decision would cost their lives. The order was clear: bow or die. There was no middle ground. There was no negotiation. There was no time to overthink. And it is precisely in this type of scenario that the mind reveals where it is grounded. Because when fear comes in, it tries to dominate everything. He creates arguments, presents easy solutions, justifies small concessions. But something inside them was different. Their minds were already aligned even before the pressure came. They didn't have to decide on the spot because they had already decided who they were and who they trusted. And this completely changes the way someone faces extreme situations. Behold, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us. Daniel 3:17. This statement carries a force that goes beyond words. It's not just trust in an outcome, it's trust in God regardless of the outcome. Because soon after, they make it clear that even if the deliverance didn't happen the way they expected, they still wouldn't bow down. This reveals the deepest level of an enlightened mind. It does not compromise its faith. It does not adapt to pressure. It does not mold itself to fear. It does not give in to what is easier. It stands firm because it is sustained by something greater than circumstances. And then comes the furnace, the heat, the threat, the impossible scenario. Everything around said it was the end. But what happens there completely changes the perspective of those who observe, because what seemed like destruction becomes a testimony. What seemed like defeat becomes a manifestation of God's presence. The mind that stands firm in the face of pressure experiences something that others do not experience, a presence in the midst of difficulty. a peace that makes no sense, a security that does not come from circumstances, but from within. How many times have you felt pressured like this? Situations where it would be easier to give in, adapt, give up principles to avoid problems. Thoughts that try to convince you that it is not worth standing firm. But it is exactly in these moments that the light of God manifests itself most intensely. Because faith is not tested in the absence of challenges, but in the presence of them. And when the mind is enlightened, it is not moved by fear, it is maintained by conviction. Maybe today you are facing a furnace in your life, something that pressures, that challenges, that tries to shake your faith. But this story shows that standing firm is not a loss, it is positioning. And it is in this positioning that something supernatural begins to happen. And if in some way this message is connecting with the situation you are living now, don't keep it just to yourself. Put before God what is in your heart. Write in the comments your prayer request as an act of faith, because when you express it, you connect with a chain of people who are also seeking the same light, the same strength, the same divine intervention. There is a silent challenge that reaches the mind of those who wait for something that has not yet happened. It's not just the delay. That's what this delay begins to generate inside. Thoughts such as, maybe it's not for me, maybe I got it wrong, maybe it's too late, begin to emerge subtly but steadily. And it was exactly this process that Sarah experienced. She received a promise that seemed beautiful, but completely out of touch with reality. Time passed, the years advanced, and what was said began to seem too distant. The human mind works like this. It measures everything by what it sees, by what it feels, by what it can calculate. And when something goes beyond that, the tendency is to doubt. Sarah even laughed, not of joy, but of unbelief, because in her logic that didn't make sense. And perhaps this is one of the most human parts of the story. Even though it was close to the promise, the mind still struggled to believe. But God does not base his promises on human logic, nor on the timing of circumstances. He is not limited to what seems possible. And this is what begins to transform the mind. When the divine light enters, it teaches you to trust beyond what is visible. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope, for he who promised is faithful. Hebrews 10:23. This word reveals that hope needs to be sustained, not passively but firmly, because in the process, everything can try to weaken that trust. Time tests, situations press, thoughts question. And it is in this scenario that the mind needs an anchor. God's promise becomes that anchor, not because you see immediate results, but because you choose to trust the one who promised. This completely changes how you go through the wait time. Sarah did not see it happen in the time she imagined, but she saw it happen in God's time. And when it happened, it wasn't just the fulfillment of something external. It was the confirmation that God never lost control, even when everything seemed delayed. How many times does the mind enter this same place, looking at life, comparing, trying to understand why certain things haven't happened yet? And in this process, hope begins to weaken, not because God has failed, but because time has not lived up to expectation. But God's light teaches something that logic cannot explain. Delay is not absence. Silence is not abandonment. And the waiting time is not a loss, it is preparation. There is something being aligned, structured, adjusted, even when it is not visible. The enlightened mind learns to wait without getting lost, learn to remain firm even without immediate signs. He learns that God's faithfulness does not depend on the human clock. And when that understanding settles within you, something changes profoundly. Anxiety loses strength, doubt begins to diminish, and a more solid confidence begins to grow, not based on what you see, but on who God is. Because in the end, it's not the promise that fails, it is the perception that needs to be aligned. And when the mind is anchored in God's faithfulness, it finds stability even in the midst of waiting. knowing that what has been promised is not lost. It is just the right time to manifest itself. There is a moment when everything seems too destroyed to start over, not just around, but inside the mind. When the person looks at their own history and sees only ruins, losses, mistakes and marks that seem impossible to rebuild. It was exactly this scenario that Nehemiah found when he looked at Jerusalem. Walls torn down, doors burned, a people without protection, without dignity, living in constant shame. But what makes this story so powerful isn't the state of the city, it's the way Nehemiah saw it. Because while many saw only destruction, he began to see possibility, not because the situation was easy, but because his mind was connected to God. Before any action, Nehemiah prays. He positions himself spiritually before moving physically, and it is in this place that something begins to change. The pain he feels does not paralyze, it drives. Sadness does not tie you to the past, it awakens you to a purpose. And then, in the face of a completely unfavorable scenario, he releases a word that breaks with the logic of the situation. Come, therefore, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and be no more a reproach. Nehemiah 2:17. This phrase is not just an invitation to rebuild walls, it is a call to restore identity, dignity, and hope. Because when the walls fell, it wasn't just the physical structure that was destroyed. It was also the way the people saw themselves. And that is exactly what the light of God does in the human mind. It does not ignore the wreckage, but it also does not allow it to define the future. It ignites a vision that goes beyond what is broken and begins to show what can be rebuilt. How many times does the mind get stuck in exactly that place? Reliving mistakes, looking at losses, believing that certain areas of life no longer have a solution. And the more you think about it, the more distant any possibility of change seems. But Nehemiah shows that when God enters history, the reconstruction begins from the inside out. First in the mind, then in the actions. First in vision, then in reality. Even with opposition, criticism, and difficulties, he did not back down. Because when the mind is enlightened, it does not allow itself to be dominated by contrary voices. She stands firm in what God has shown, and little by little, what seemed impossible begins to take shape. Stone by stone, step by step. Not all at once, but continuously. This reveals that the restore doesn't have to be instantaneous to be real. It can be progressive but still powerful. Maybe today there are areas in your life that look exactly like that. Broken, stopped, without perspective. But the same light that reached Nehemiah is still available. It rekindles strength, awakens vision, and releases courage to start, even without having everything resolved. Because God does not work only with what is whole. He also rebuilds what was destroyed, and when he begins, it's not just to notice, it is to restore even stronger. If that message has found something inside you, like it's speaking directly to an area you already thought was lost, don't ignore it. There is a purpose in this. Write in the comments, God chose me. Sometimes acknowledging this is the first step to seeing the rebuilding begin. There is a battle that takes place before any result appears, and it is not fought with the hands, but within the mind. Because when a situation rises up against you, the first thing that tries to be hit is not the outside, it is their peace, their confidence, their inner stability. Jehoshaphat faced just that when he received the news that a large army was coming against him. The scenario was totally unfavorable. There was no advantage, there was not enough human strategy, there was no guarantee of victory. And at that moment, he could have reacted as many would, with fear, desperation, or an attempt to control. But instead, he did something that completely changes the dynamics of the situation. He sought God. Before any move, before any decision, he has positioned his mind, and in doing so, He received a direction that made no logical sense, but carried a profound spiritual power. The instruction was not to organize the army to fight. It was putting people forward to praise. This reveals a principle that few understand. There are battles that are not won with human effort, but with spiritual positioning. And when they began to sing and give praise, the Lord laid ambushes against the children of Ammon. 2 Chronicles 20:22. Notice the exact moment of change. It wasn't after the victory. It wasn't when the enemy retreated. That's when they started praising. This means that the victory began in the invisible, before any evidence in the visible. Praise in this context was not just music or words. It was a statement of trust. It was the mind saying, "I'm not based on what I see, but on who God is." And when this posture is assumed, something begins to move beyond what the eye can see. How many times have you faced situations where you tried to solve everything with effort, thought, worry, and yet nothing has changed? This is because not every war is resolved on the natural level. Some require a spiritual alignment that rearranges the invisible environment before any external change. The enlightened mind understands this. She learns that even in the midst of pressure, it is possible to choose to trust, that even in the face of fear, it is possible to declare faith, and that this position is not passive, it is powerful. Jehoshaphat did not ignore the problem, but he decided not to allow the problem to define his answer. And that made all the difference, because when the mind aligns itself with God, it stops reacting to what it sees and starts responding to what it believes. Maybe today there is a battle going on in your life that seems bigger than you can bear, something you don't know how to solve, how to face, or how to win. But this story reveals that victory doesn't start when everything changes. It begins when your mind is positioned. And when this happens, what seemed impossible begins to reorganize, not by its strength, but by the action of God. Maybe you've been waiting for an answer for a long time, and it may be that what you need most now is not more effort, but a new positioning. Stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed can show you how to access this dimension where victory begins before it even appears. There is a moment in the journey when the mind stops revolving only around its own needs and begins to see something bigger. So far, you have seen how God transforms thoughts, heals wounds, directs paths. But now, a deeper dimension emerges, when God's light leads you to care about that which is not just about you. Esther got to exactly that point. She didn't start her story thinking about saving a people. She was living her own reality, inside a palace, protected, away from the chaos that was happening outside. But suddenly, a piece of information breaks through this comfort zone. A decree had been issued, and his people were threatened with destruction. And at that moment, something began to happen inside her mind. It wasn't just worry. It was a calling, an awakening that could not be ignored. And who knoweth whether thou hast come to this kingdom for such a time as this? Esther 4:14. This question wasn't just about position, it was about purpose. Because many times God puts someone in a place, in a condition, in a specific situation, not only for one's own benefit, but to fulfill something greater that involves other lives. Esther could have chosen silence. He could have protected his own safety, ignored the problem, moved on with his life without getting involved. But when the mind is enlightened by God, it can no longer live in isolation. She begins to feel the weight of what is happening around her. And that's where intercession is born. Interceding is not just praying for someone, it is taking a spiritual stand for a cause that goes beyond you. It is allowing God's heart to become your heart in relation to a situation. It is to carry in prayer what perhaps another person does not have the strength to carry. Esther did not act impulsively. She understood that she needed to prepare herself spiritually. Fasting, prayer, alignment, because the battle she was about to face wasn't just political or emotional, it was spiritual. This reveals something powerful. The enlightened mind does not live only to resolve its own conflicts. It participates in God's plans. It becomes a conduit through which something greater begins to happen. How many times have you felt something like this? A wait for someone, a concern that goes beyond the normal, a desire to pray without knowing exactly why. This may not be a coincidence. It could be God calling you to intercede, because when you position yourself in this way, you enter a dimension where your prayers are not just words, they become part of something that God is doing. Esther risked her own life, but she wasn't moved by despair, she was moved by purpose, and when she decided to act, what seemed impossible began to transform. Maybe today, God is awakening you to something that goes beyond yourself. And if this message has reached you, there is a reason. Allow yourself to continue receiving this direction. If you are not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this journey can open your mind to spiritual levels that you have not yet experienced. There is a kind of moment when everything around seems hostile, as if the world has become a place of constant pressure, where every step requires care and every decision carries weight. Elijah lived exactly that. After intense experiences with God, after seeing miracles happen, he finds himself in a completely opposite situation, persecuted, threatened, forced to hide. And it is at this point that many imagine that God's presence manifests itself in a visible, powerful, immediate way. But what happens is different. God does not take him to a prominent place, but to a hiding place. An isolated, silent, seemingly unimportant place. And here lies a profound secret about how God works in the human mind. Because when everything slows down on the outside, something starts to be reorganized on the inside. Elijah was not just fleeing from an external threat, he was being led into an environment where his mind could find rest. Because there is no point in living intense spiritual experiences if there is no place of pause, sustenance, recovery. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning. 1 Kings 17:6. This detail seems simple, but it reveals something extraordinary. God was taking care of him in an unexpected, silent, constant way. There were no crowds, there was no recognition, there were no big movements, only daily provision. And this teaches something that few realize. God's presence is not only manifested in great moments, but also in discreet, repeated, faithful care. The enlightened mind learns to recognize God in these details. He learns to rest even when everything around him seems unstable, because he understands that sustenance does not come from the environment, but from presence. How many times does the person get worn out precisely because they do not accept this type of process? It wants quick answers, immediate solutions, visible changes. But God often begins in the hidden, in silence, in the place where no one sees. And it is in this place that the mind finds something that it could not find in the midst of the noise: stability, clarity, renewal. Elijah was being prepared. That was not an end, it was a strategic break, a time where God was strengthening, sustaining, and aligning everything for what would come later. Maybe you're in a moment like that too. A time that seems still, silent, even confusing, as if nothing was happening. But the truth is that many times it is exactly in these periods that God is most at work. Divine light not only illuminates active paths, it also calms the mind in times of waiting. It teaches that not all movement is advancement and not all silence is absence, because when you learn to recognize the presence of God in the hiding place, in the detail, in the daily care, something changes profoundly. Anxiety decreases, confidence grows, and the mind begins to rest, even without understanding everything. And it is in this rest that new directions begin to emerge. not in a hurried way, but in line, not based on external pressure, but on internal conduction. Because God doesn't just sustain, it prepares new beginnings, even when everything seems just to break. There is a kind of encounter with God that not only consoles, but confronts, not only calms, but transforms immediately. Isaiah lived exactly that moment. He entered the temple, perhaps expecting another ordinary day of worship, another moment of spiritual routine. But what he found was something that completely changed his mind, his perception, and his life. He saw the glory of God, not in a superficial way, not in a symbolic way, but in such a real way that everything inside him was exposed. Because when God's light truly manifests, it doesn't just illuminate what's around us, it reveals what's inside. Isaiah, who until then was a prophet, someone accustomed to the things of God, suddenly finds himself fully aware of his own condition. He does not compare, he does not justify himself, he does not hide. He recognizes it. And it is at this moment that something profound happens, because the light that exposes is also the same that purifies. And he said, "Behold, this has touched your lips, and your iniquity has been taken away." Isaiah 6:7. This touch was not just a symbol, it was a transformation. What was misaligned was corrected. That which needed to be cleaned up was removed. And all of this happened in a single encounter. This reveals a powerful principle. True encounters with God do not leave a person in the same state. They adjust, align, reposition. Not superficially, but at the root. Often the mind gets used to a distant spirituality based only on habits, repeated words, moments without depth. But when there is a real encounter, everything changes. The way of thinking changes. The way of seeing changes. The way of living changes. Isaiah did not leave that place with just an experience. He left with a purpose. Because after purification comes sending. After the light reveals, it directs. And it shows that God's presence is not just to bring comfort, but to prepare you for something greater, to align your mind with what He desires to do through your life. Perhaps what is missing is not more information, more effort, or more attempts. Maybe it's a real meeting, a moment where you really stand before God without distractions, without masks, without reservations. Because when this happens, the light enters directly. It reveals what needs to be adjusted, removes what needs to come out, and positions you for something new. And this kind of transformation doesn't depend on time. It depends on the intensity of the delivery. And when the mind goes through this kind of experience, it doesn't go back to the previous state. Something changes profoundly. There is more clarity, more sensitivity, more alignment. Few people understand this level of dating, but if you're here, there's a reason. Continue to the end, because there is still something being prepared that can take you to an even deeper level of spiritual transformation and understanding. There is a truth that the mind understands only when it goes through difficult processes. God's purpose is not interrupted by circumstances, it is revealed through them. Jose lived this intensely. His story doesn't start with pain, it starts with a dream, a clear, strong, meaningful dream. But the path to the fulfillment of this dream was completely different from what he could have imagined. He was betrayed by those who were closer. He was sold, humiliated, taken to an unknown place. And as if that were not enough, even when he began to get back on his feet, he was unjustly accused and thrown into prison. Each step seemed to take him further away from the purpose, as if everything was going wrong. And this is exactly where many get lost. Because when reality contradicts what was promised, the mind begins to question everything. Did I get it wrong? Did God really speak? Why is everything happening like this? But what differentiates Joseph is not the absence of difficulties. It is the way his mind remained aligned in the midst of them. He did not allow the pain to distort his vision. He did not let injustice define his identity. Even in silence, even in oblivion, something within him remained firm. God's light continued to guide, even when nothing seemed to make sense. Joseph did not know how, he did not know when, but he kept advancing. And this reveals something powerful. The enlightened mind does not need to understand the whole path. It just trusts the one who is leading. And then, at the right moment, what seemed disconnected begins to line up. Every step, every pain, every delay, everything begins to make sense within a larger plan. He leaves prison for the government, from oblivion to authority, from suffering to fulfillment, and when he finally finds himself before those who caused his pain, he releases a statement that reveals the level of transformation that has taken place within him. You meant evil against me, but God has made it good. Genesis 50:20. This phrase is not just forgiveness, it is understanding. It is the mind seeing beyond human actions and recognizing the hand of God in the whole process. Because when divine light fills the mind, it changes the interpretation of history. What once seemed like a loss becomes preparation. What seemed like delay reveals itself as alignment. What seemed like injustice turns into positioning. How many times have you looked at your own life and thought that something got completely out of control? Moments that didn't make sense, situations that seemed unfair, paths that seemed wrong. But what if, like Joseph, it's all part of something bigger that you can't yet see? God's purpose is not fragile. It does not depend on perfect circumstances to happen. It manifests itself precisely in the midst of the improbable, the unexpected, the difficult. And when the mind begins to be enlightened by this truth, something changes profoundly. The person stops reacting to what happens and starts to trust in what God is doing, even without seeing everything. Because in the end, it is not the circumstances that define the fate. It is God's leading that leads every detail to the fulfillment of what He has already established. There is a moment in the journey when faith has already begun, transformation has already begun, but the mind still needs to be steady. Because between the encounter with God and the consolidation of spiritual identity, there is a process that requires perseverance. And the disciples experienced just that after Jesus' resurrection. They had walked with Him, heard His teachings, seen extraordinary miracles. But when it all happened, when the cross came, when silence took over, their minds were confused. What seemed so clear began to shuffle. Fear, doubt, and uncertainty began to take up space. Even after the resurrection, they still did not fully understand what was happening. This shows that God's light does not always illuminate everything at once. Often, it comes progressively, adjusting the mind little by little. And then something remarkable happens. On the road to Emmaus, 2 disciples walk discouraged, trying to understand the events. And Jesus approaches, but they do not recognize Him. This reveals something profound. It is possible to be close to the answer and still not realize it when the mind is clouded. But as He begins to speak, something changes, not immediately in the eyes, but first on the inside. Words begin to organize what was confusing, begin to bring meaning where there was doubt, begin to rekindle something that seemed erased. Did not our hearts burn within us when He spoke to us on the way? Luke 24:32. This burning was not a passing emotion. It was the light coming in. It was the understanding being restored. It was the mind coming back into alignment with the truth. And that's exactly how God works. He doesn't just show the way, He explains, reveals, connects. Spiritual identity is not only based on experiences, but on understanding. Because when you understand who God is, who you are in Him, and what the purpose of your walk is, something stabilizes within you. The disciples did not remain in the confusion. They kept walking. They kept listening, they kept searching, and little by little everything became clear. And this clarity brought strength. Those who had previously been hidden were now firm. Those who had once been afraid were now filled with courage. This reveals that the enlightened mind is not born ready. It is built on perseverance, to continue even without understanding everything, not staying even when there are doubts, in listening over and over again until the truth becomes part of who you are. Maybe you're in that process right now. You have had experiences, you have felt the presence of God, but there are still areas of doubt, moments of confusion, unanswered questions. And that doesn't mean something is wrong. It means that you are on the path, because the light of God continues to work, clarify, strengthen, align. And the longer you stay, the more your identity takes hold, the more your mind stabilizes, the more your faith becomes unshakable. And if that message is bringing clarity to something you were trying to understand, respond to it with a simple but powerful statement. Write in the comments, "I trust in God's action." Because when that truth is stated, it begins to strengthen within you in an even deeper way. There is a level of the battle that does not happen outside, but inside the mind, where thoughts try to take control, distort truths, and weaken decisions. And it is exactly in this invisible field that Jesus reveals to us one of the greatest teachings about inner mastery. In the wilderness, he wasn't just facing physical starvation, he was being confronted in his identity, in his purpose, and in his trust in God. The scenario was already challenging. Isolation, physical weakness, silence. And it is precisely at this moment that thoughts begin to be attacked. Temptation does not begin with actions, it begins with suggestions. "If thou art the Son of God." This phrase was not just a provocation, it was an attempt to generate doubt. Because when the mind starts questioning who you are, everything around you becomes unstable. But Jesus does not respond with emotion. He doesn't get into debate. He doesn't try to argue based on feelings. He responds with something solid, unchanging, non-negotiable: the Word. "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God." Matthew 4:4. This answer reveals an absolute principle. The mind is not strengthened by what it feels, but by what is firmed. Jesus did not deny the famine, but he did not allow it to determine his decision. He showed that physical needs cannot govern a mind that is aligned with God. The temptation continues, changing shape, but with the same goal: to distort the truth. Questioning identity, offering shortcuts, proposing solutions outside God's time. And in each attempt, the answer is the same. There is no negotiation. There is no room for doubt. There is positioning. This shows that mastery of the mind does not happen by chance. It is born of submission to the Holy Spirit, who strengthens the interior and aligns thoughts with truth. Because thoughts will come, pressures will exist, doubts will try to settle in, but what defines the outcome is what you accept or reject. How many times does the mind conflict just like that? Thoughts that question your worth, your faith, your purpose. Suggestions that seem reasonable, but that deviate from the path. And many times the person tries to fight it only with willpower, only with emotion, and ends up wearing out. But what Jesus teaches is different. The mental battle is not won with emotional effort. It is won with spiritual positioning. It is knowing what God has said and staying at it, even when everything around you tries to prove otherwise. The light of God at this level manifests as inner authority, a conviction that does not waver, that does not negotiate, that does not adapt to pressure, a mind that recognizes truth and rejects everything that is not aligned with it. And when that authority is established within you, something changes completely. Thoughts lose strength, doubts diminish, and clarity becomes constant, not because temptations disappear, but because you already know how to respond. Because in the end, it's not about avoiding the battle. It's about being prepared to beat it where it really happens, inside the mind. There is a type of pain that does not make noise on the outside, but constantly echoes inside. An anguish that is repeated, that accumulates, that seems to have no visible solution. Anna lived exactly like that, year after year, carrying a silent weight, dealing with frustration, comparison, sadness, and the most difficult, without understanding why it had not yet changed. His mind was filled with this scenario. Thoughts that came back, emotions that intensified, a cycle that seemed to have no end. And perhaps the most exhausting thing was not only the situation itself, but what it produced within it. Because when pain is prolonged, it begins to affect the way a person thinks, feels, and even positions themselves in life. But there comes a time when Anna does something different. Instead of just carrying it inside her, she decides to pour it all out before God. Not superficially, not with ready-made words, but with deep sincerity. She turns her pain into prayer, and that changes everything. Because when someone stands before God in this way, something begins to happen even before any external response. The mind begins to be reorganized. The weight begins to be lightened. The anguish begins to lose space. Anna did not leave that moment with an immediate answer to what she was experiencing, but it came out different inside. And his countenance was no longer sad. 1 Samuel 1:18. This detail reveals something powerful. The circumstance was still the same, the problem still existed, but her mind was no longer in the same place. God's light had filled something within her that the situation could no longer overcome. This shows that God's response doesn't just begin when something changes on the outside. It begins when something is adjusted from the inside. When the mind finds peace, even without having all the answers. When the heart calms down, even without seeing the immediate solution. How many times does a person wait for everything to be resolved in order to have peace? But God works the other way around. It releases peace so that the person can go through the process with stability. Anna trusted, not because it all made sense, but because he decided to deliver. And this surrender made room for the light of God to reorganize her thoughts, her emotions, her way of seeing. The enlightened mind learns to rest in the sovereignty of God. He learns that not everything needs to be resolved immediately for there to be peace. He learns that there is care happening even when it is not visible. And when that trust is established, something changes profoundly. Anxiety subsides, despair loses strength, and a quiet security begins to grow. Maybe you're carrying something like that today. A pain that seems to have no answer, a weight that repeats itself, a situation that has not yet changed. But what this story reveals is that there is a path where the mind finds peace before the solution appears. And when you allow yourself to enter that place, when you decide to pour and trust and surrender, the light of God begins to fill every space that was previously occupied by anguish, bringing a stability that does not depend on circumstances, but on the presence that sustains everything. There is a point in the spiritual journey where it is no longer about feeling like it, but about deciding to stay, because the mind, when it is not disciplined, becomes hostage to impulses, emotions, and constant variations. One day it is firm, the next it is weak. One moment is motivated, the next is distant. And it is exactly here that many are lost, not for lack of faith, but for lack of constancy. Ezra reveals a different path. He did not build his spiritual life in isolated moments, but in an ongoing commitment. His mind was not guided by what he felt, but by what he decided to live every day, and this completely changes the level of clarity and inner stability. For Ezra had prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord and to do it. Ezra 7:10. This preparation did not happen automatically. It was a choice. He decided to seek, he decided to practice, and he decided to teach. There is a powerful sequence here: seek, apply, and share. This shows that God's light does not just enter the mind, it needs to be cultivated. Many people want transformation, but without discipline. They want clarity, but without constancy. They want growth, but without commitment. And this creates a cycle where the person even advances for a moment, but does not sustain himself. The enlightened mind works differently. She understands that spiritual growth is not based on emotional peaks, but on consistent practices. It is in the ordinary day, in the routine, in the silence, that the light is strengthened within you. Ezra didn't expect to feel something special to seek God. He had already decided that he would do it. And this decision created an internal environment where the mind remained aligned, firm, stable. How often does a lack of discipline weaken what God has already started? The person receives direction, feels a transformation, but does not sustain it on a daily basis. And little by little, what seemed strong begins to diminish. But when there is discipline, something different happens. The mind begins to get used to the truth. Thoughts begin to align more easily. Decisions become firmer, and what once required effort becomes natural. Spiritual discipline is not a burden, it is protection. It protects your mind against distractions, against oscillations, against everything that tries to misalign you. She keeps the light on even when emotions don't help. And that requires delivery. It requires giving up momentary will to sustain something greater. It requires deciding to stay even when there is no motivation. But it is exactly in this place that the transformation is consolidated. Perhaps what is missing is not more revelation, but more constancy. Because when you stay, even on ordinary days, something begins to strengthen in a deep and lasting way. And this silent construction is what sustains a truly enlightened mind. In the next few minutes, something even deeper will be revealed, something that can definitively align what you have already begun to live. Stay on your toes, because it may be just what you need to take the next step firmly. There is a level of the spiritual walk where it is no longer just about knowing what is right, but about perceiving the exact moment to act. Because there are decisions that do not come with evident logic, do not follow predictable patterns, and do not make sense at first glance. But they carry a purpose that is only revealed to a mind sensitive to the Spirit. Philip lived just that. He was in a place where everything seemed to flow well. There was movement, results, people being reached, but suddenly he receives a completely unexpected direction. It wasn't to stay there. It wasn't to stay where it seemed productive. It was to go to the desert. And that's one of the most challenging parts, because when God directs, he doesn't always explain. Often he just leads. And the mind needs to be sensitive enough to obey, even without fully understanding it. Felipe doesn't question, doesn't try to adjust the direction, doesn't ask for details. He just will. And it is in this movement that something begins to reveal itself. In the middle of that seemingly empty path, a specific encounter arises with a specific person at an exact moment. Nothing there was a coincidence. Everything was aligned by a direction that did not come from logic, but from Spirit. And the Spirit said unto Philip, Come near, and gather thyself unto this chariot. Acts 8:29. This statement seems simple, but it carries depth. God did not give a complete plan, did not explain the whole purpose, only indicated the next step. And this reveals how the enlightened mind works. It does not need to see everything. It just needs to obey what has already been revealed. How many times does the person freeze precisely because they want to understand everything before acting? Expect total clarity, complete confirmation, absolute security, and ends up not moving. But God works differently. It guides you step by step, detail by detail. Felipe approaches, listens, understands the moment, and acts. And that encounter completely changes that man's life. A direction that seemed small becomes part of something much bigger. This shows that God cares about details. It directs specific encounters, situations, moments. But this is only perceived by those who are attentive, by those who have developed spiritual sensitivity. The enlightened mind does not live only by big signs, but by small directions. He learns to perceive when he should speak, when he should move, when he should wait. And this sensitivity is not born overnight. It is built on the journey, on communion, on the willingness to listen. Maybe you're waiting for a clear answer, something big, an evident direction. But it may be that God is already speaking in a simple, subtle way, pointing only to the next step. And the key is not to understand everything, but to obey what has already been shown. Because when you respond to those little directions, something starts to line up. Paths open, encounters happen, purposes are revealed. Not because you planned everything, but because you decided to trust. And it is in this place that the mind enters a new level. A level where he lives not only by what he understands, but by what he discerns. Where it does not depend only on logic, but on the guidance of the Spirit. And when this happens, each step stops being random and becomes part of a larger plan being revealed little by little. There is a turning point in the transformation of the mind that many avoid facing. It is not possible to move forward carrying what should have been left behind, because the light of God even illuminates new paths, but if the mind remains stuck in the past, progress becomes limited, slow, incomplete. And Lot's story reveals just such an internal conflict. God had already given the direction. Leaving Sodom was not a suggestion, it was a necessity. That environment no longer supported the purpose, it no longer matched what God wanted to do. And even then, there was hesitation, not only in the steps, but in the heart. Because physically leaving is easier than mentally shutting down. Lot was led out, but something inside his house was still connected to what remained. And this is revealed at the most critical moment, when the instruction was clear, do not look back. That order wasn't just about physical direction, it was about mental positioning. Because looking back in that context meant attachment, longing, resistance to break away completely. It was an emotional connection to something that was no longer part of God's plan. And Lot's wife looked back and became a pillar of salt. Genesis 19:26. This moment carries a deep weight. It wasn't the exit that defined the result, it was the look. This shows that the mind needs to follow the decision. It is not enough to take steps forward if thoughts remain attached to what remained. How often does this happen silently? The person decides to change, decides to move forward, decides to look for something new, but it keeps revisiting the past inside the mind. Memories, habits, bonds, old thoughts continue to occupy space, weakening the new one that is being built. And this creates an internal conflict, because the light points forward, but the mind insists on looking back. And in this state, the advance becomes heavy, inconsistent. True transformation requires definitive decisions, not only external, but internal. It is a breakup that begins in the mind. It is choosing not to feed what has already been left. It's understanding that certain things can't be taken to the next level. God did not ask Lot to negotiate with the past. He asked to abandon it completely, because he knew that any connection could compromise the future. The enlightened mind learns to let go. He learns to release what is no longer part of it. He learns that what was left behind cannot define what is to come. Maybe there is something like that in your life, something you've already left physically but still revisit mentally, something that somehow still holds your attention, your emotion, your thoughts. But this history shows that progress requires a clear position. Not looking back is not ignoring the past. It is not allowing it to continue influencing the present, because when the mind finally aligns with God's leading, without divisions, without hesitation, something changes completely. The path becomes lighter, clearer, firmer, and what once seemed difficult to leave loses strength in the face of what God is revealing ahead. God's light doesn't just show you where to go. It also teaches you what needs to be left behind in order for you to really move forward. There is a time in life when the challenge seems greater than any strength you believe you have. A moment when the problem arises in such an imposing way that it not only intimidates from the outside, but begins to echo inside the mind, trying to convince you that there is no way out. It was exactly this scenario that David found when he came across Goliath. Everyone saw the same giant, everyone heard the same threats, everyone felt the same fear. But the difference was not in the size of the enemy. It was in the way each one interpreted it within their own mind. While many looked and felt smaller, David looked and saw something completely different. He did not deny reality, but he also did not allow her to define his reaction. This reveals something profound. The greatest battlefield was not in that valley. It was within the mind of every single person who was there. And David won there first. When he decides to move forward, it is not based on passing emotion or impulse. It is based on conviction. He knew who God was. He knew what he had already experienced. And he knew that this situation did not change this truth. You come to me with a sword, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. 1 Samuel 17:45. This statement shows that spiritual courage is not born of the absence of fear, but of the presence of a greater truth within the mind. David was not focused on the size of Goliath, but on the authority of God. How many times have you found yourself in front of giants like this? Problems that seem too big, situations that seem impossible to solve, thoughts that try to convince you that it won't work. And little by little, this shapes their reaction, diminishing their strength, weakening their confidence. But the enlightened mind works differently. She doesn't ignore the challenge, but she doesn't bow to it either. She takes a stand. She remembers. She declares. David didn't build that confidence at that moment. It was already inside him, formed over time, in the experiences with God, in the moments when no one saw it. And this is what sustains someone in the face of greater challenges. Because when the mind is aligned with the truth, the size of the problem loses the power to define the outcome. What defines is who is with you. And as David advances, something extraordinary happens. What seemed impossible becomes possible. What intimidated everyone cannot stop someone who is firm inside. This is not about physical strength. It's about spiritual positioning. It's about a mind that doesn't negotiate with fear, that doesn't accept defeat before battle, that doesn't allow negative thoughts to dominate. Perhaps today there is a Goliath before you, something that seems big, difficult, intimidating. But this story reveals that the size of the challenge is not the deciding factor. What really matters is how your mind is positioned before him. Because when God's light fills your mind, it makes you see differently, think differently, act differently. And what once seemed impossible begins to lose strength in the face of the truth that now sustains you. At the end of this video, something even deeper will be released about your life, something that can strengthen your mind in a way you've never experienced. Stay until the end, because that may be the time when everything begins to change within you. There is a force that many underestimate because it does not manifest itself in the way the world expects. It is not noisy. It does not depend on favorable circumstances. It does not need external control to exist. It is spiritual joy. And she is not born when everything is fine. She reveals herself when everything seems to be against her. Paulo and Silas were imprisoned. Not by mistake, not by failure, but by doing what God had called them to do. They were wronged, assaulted, chained and thrown into a dark, closed environment with no immediate prospect of change. Humanly speaking, this was a perfect scenario for discouragement, revolt or silence. But what happens there completely breaks with natural logic. And near midnight, Paul and Silas prayed and sang hymns to God. Acts 16:25. This moment carries a profound revelation. They did not wait for freedom to praise. They did not wait for the chains to fall to pray. They decided to connect with God at exactly the darkest point of the situation. This shows that spiritual joy is not a reaction to one's surroundings. It is a decision based on connection with God. Their minds were not tied to what surrounded them. It was aligned with something bigger. While the body was limited, the mind was free. While the environment was prison, the interior was free. And that's exactly what God's light does. It creates a space within you that can't be controlled by external circumstances. How many times does the mind become hostage to the environment? If all is well, there is peace. If something goes wrong, everything falls apart inside. This happens because joy is being built on what is unstable. But Paul and Silas show another way. A path where the mind connects with God in such a deep way that the environment loses the power to define the inner state. And when that connection happens, something starts to change. First, in the invisible, the atmosphere is transformed. The spiritual environment is affected, and then what seemed impossible begins to happen. The chains come loose, the doors open, the prison is shaken. But all this starts before. It begins with the decision to praise. Spiritual joy is not about ignoring pain. It is choosing not to be overwhelmed by it. It is to declare, even in silence, that God remains God, regardless of what is happening around him. Maybe today you are in a midnight of life, a dark, silent moment, difficult to understand. But this story reveals that there is a force available that can sustain your mind, even in this scenario. And when you access that joy, something changes. Not just outside, but inside. The mind is strengthened, hope is rekindled, and what seemed heavy begins to lose strength. If that word found you at exactly such a time, as if it were describing something you are living right now, respond to it in faith. Write in the comments, "I believe, Lord," because sometimes a simple statement is the beginning of a liberation that begins within and reaches all around. Everything you've just realized points to a quiet but powerful truth. It's not just about understanding God's light. It's about allowing it to occupy every space within you, because there comes a time when it is not enough to listen. It is not enough to reflect. It is necessary to surrender. The mind that has been touched now needs to open. The heart that has been awakened now needs to respond. And ye shall seek me and find me when ye search for me with all your heart. Jeremiah 29:13. This promise is not distant, it is direct. God is not far away. He is accessible to those who decide to seek him in a true way. And perhaps, after everything that has been revealed so far, this is exactly the time to do so. Not in a hurry, not automatically, but sincerely. Now take your attention inward. Let go of your surroundings for a moment and allow your mind to quiet down. This is a moment between you and God. A moment of surrender, of alignment, of meeting. Let's pray together, setting before him all that is within you, trusting that he is hearing, seeing, and ready to act. Beloved Father, your word reminds us that there is a peace that cannot be explained, only experienced. And it is in that promise that we now stand before you. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Lord, we approach with humility, recognizing that we need your light to completely transform our minds. We thank you for all that has been revealed so far, for each teaching, for each direction, for each truth that has touched our interior. Thank you that you do not leave us in the darkness of our own thoughts, but lead us to a new way of thinking, lighter, clearer, more aligned with your will. Now, Father, we ask you, come deep into our mind. Purify every thought that does not come from you. It removes all anxiety, all fear, all guilt, all memory that still holds, all negative pattern that insists on remaining. May every lie be broken by your truth. May all confusion be dispelled by your light. Holy Spirit, take control of our interior, renew our understanding. It teaches us to think as the Lord thinks, to see as the Lord sees, to react as the Lord wishes. It strengthens our faith, sustains our mind in times of pressure, and establishes within us a peace that does not depend on circumstances. Lord, we also present before you all the areas of our life. It touches those who are sick, bringing healing and restoration. It meets financial needs, opening paths where there are none. It restores families, heals relationships, brings unity where there was division. It strengthens those who are weary, lifts up those who are downcast, and brings direction to those who are lost. At this moment in silence, each heart opens before you. Receive, Lord, every request, every tear, every thought that was not spoken in words, but that you know deeply. Father, we commend everything into your hands. Our fears, our dreams, our doubts, and our challenges, we choose to trust even without understanding everything. We choose to rest in your sovereignty, knowing that you are in control of every detail. We now declare that our mind belongs to you, that our thoughts will be aligned with your truth, that no contrary voice will have more strength within us. May your light fill every space, bringing clarity, direction, and peace. And we remain confident because we know that the Lord is faithful to fulfill all that he has promised. May your peace keep us, sustain us, and lead us every day. We pray with faith, with surrender, and with trust. In the name of Jesus, amen. Everything you've heard so far has not been by chance. Every teaching, every passage, every revelation points to a central truth. God desires to fill your mind with his light, not superficially, but profoundly, transformingly, and continuously. This message is for you. In the midst of so many thoughts, doubts, and pressures of everyday life, there is a light available capable of reorganizing everything inside, bringing clarity where there was confusion, peace where there was anxiety, and direction where before there was only uncertainty. God has chosen you to hear this today because he knows exactly what you have been facing in silence. Now the question that remains is, are you willing to allow this light to occupy all the spaces of your mind, including those that you still try to control on your own? And you know, it's very special to know that you're here until this moment, walking along on this journey. It shows that there is something inside you seeking more of God, seeking growth, seeking transformation. And I want to invite you to take a small step that can generate something big. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and activate the bell to continue receiving these messages. But more than that, I want to meet you. Right here in the comments of where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share a little of what you are experiencing. Your story matters, and there is a community here ready to pray with you and for you. And it doesn't end there. There's something even deeper being prepared for you in the next video. Let's keep moving forward, understanding how to live daily with our minds aligned with God, how to stay in that light even in the midst of challenges, and how to experience, in a practical way, the plans he has already laid out for your life. Don't miss it, because each step of this journey is a construction that will strengthen you from the inside out. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of his plans. Don't stop here. because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater than any attack. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and I'll wait for you in the next video.